Hello there, and welcome to episode 3 of Lawson Literature. In this episode, I'll be doing a double book review of two books I have read recently, and here they are. They are Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis versus The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. All right, so let's begin just summarising what Mere Christianity is about. And this Mere Christianity is an apologetics book written by C.S. Lewis, who was a fantasy fiction writer in the early 20th century. And former atheist who was converted to Christianity. And this book was written as a summary of radio broadcasts that Lewis delivered during the Second World War as a way of providing comfort and solace to British listeners and to restore them to their faith in Christianity. And moving to The God Delusion, The God Delusion is a book inspired by the new atheism movement, which came about at the beginning of the new millennia. This was a reaction to theism and religion, which claim that supernatural belief is ultimately hostile to the progression of humanity and reason. It is written by Richard Dawkins, a scientist and secular activist who you may have heard about or seen in many a God debate on YouTube or TV or anywhere else. So let's dive straight into these citations. I'm quite excited about this one because it's a bit like a battle, and it's a theological debate, which always interests me. So let's begin on the theistic side, on the theistic spectrum, with a quote from Lewis. He says that on page 13, he says that progress means not just changing, but changing for the better. So he says that the moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. End quote. And yeah, I do see how that works, and that's as I've sort of contemplated God and thought about his existence, I kind of thought, well, probably one of the best reasons there are for God's existence would be the moral argument, would be this sense that there are things that we just know are wrong. Like we know stealing someone's food or something is wrong. And we know that acts of charity or acts of, altruism, giving money away to people and to people on the street or whatever, we know that's a good thing, regardless of whether or not we think it's a good thing or not. And what Lewis is trying to say here is that without God, our sense of morality would just be entirely down to our opinions. It would be entirely subjective. That would obviously he would kind of say, oh, that would just lead to kind of chaos in our society. But let's examine that question a little further as we go on. I'll go to Dawkins's quote now from The God Delusion on page 107. He says, he talks about the Australian philosopher Douglas Garsky. And here is the extent of Douglas Garsky's reasoning against God. And he would say that, number one, the creation of the world is the most marvelous achievement imaginable, and he uses the Socratic method as to move on to the other points, the other sort of chains of reasoning. So after this 1.1, he moves on to 2 and says that the merit of an achievement is the product of A, its intrinsic quality, and B, the ability of its creator. Number 3, the greater the disability or handicap of the creator, the more impressive the achievement. 4, the most formidable handicap for a creator would be non-existence. 5, therefore, if we suppose that the universe is the product of an existent creator, we can conceive a greater being, namely, one who created everything while not existing. Number 6, an existing God therefore would not be a being greater than which a greater an existing God would not be a being greater than which a greater cannot be conceived, because an even more formidable and incredible creator would be a God which did not exist. Ergo, 7, God does not exist. End quote. And I like that one because it's kind of, he goes along the lines that, the best creator, the most formidable creator would be a creator that didn't exist. If the creator existed, then it would be kind of easier for the creator to have created the universe, and so we don't need to admire them as much in that sense. But also, his point as well is that there is this infinite regress where you kind of say, yeah, God created the world, if you say that, but then what created God? And then what created that? And what created that? And then what created that? And you just this constant to infinity questioning questioning the creator, if you like. And then on Lewis kind of rebuttals this on page 21. He says, I now want to consider what this moral law tells us about the universe we live in. First, there is what is called the materialist view. Matter and space just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. And on page 22, he says that the other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and has purposes and prefers one thing to another. End quote. And yeah, it's very easy to see how that would work out, how a God would have purposes for the universe, because of almost the miracle of life, in a way, like the fact that the earth is in the perfect position from the sun to produce life, and there's this, it's the conditions for life are so perfect that is giving us the idea that it comes from some sort of conscious creator. But that said, I would go with the materialist view quite a lot, and say that actually, matter and space, I don't like to use the word fluke, really. He kind of takes the mick out of it here by saying it happened by a sort of fluke. Well, no, it didn't happen by a sort of fluke. We just don't know. We don't know how it came about, but life simply evolves, and that's as far as we know. That's probably what I would say on that one. But continuing on to Dawkins's point here, he says, why there almost certainly is no God. He says on page 103, and he's talking about intelligent design here, and this is a kind of rebuttal to the intelligent design theory, that there was a conscious being who created everything. He says that a deep understanding of Darwinism teaches us to be wary of the easy assumption that design is the only alternative to chance, and teaches us to seek out graded ramps of slowly increasing complexity. Before Darwin, philosophers such as Hume understood that the improbability of life did not mean it had to be designed, but they couldn't imagine the alternative. After Darwin, we all should feel, deep in our bones, suspicious of the very idea of design. The illusion of design is a trap that has caught us before, and Darwin should have immunized us by raising our consciousness. Would that he had succeeded with all of us. End quote. And I like that one. This kind of implies that a lot of people have basically ignored what Darwin has discovered. As you may know, Darwin was a biologist who came up with who hypothesized the theory of evolution in the 1800s, much to very conflicting reception in Britain by the church and so on, who rejected the idea that we evolved from monkeys, because they, obviously, creationists who believe in the Bible would believe that we were created by God and all stem from Adam and Eve. In fact, actually, the Bible says that Adam was created first, and I think, and might get this wrong, I think God takes the side of Adam's rib and rips it out or something, or makes a clone of it of some kind, and then that's how Eve is kind of created out of that, which is quite interesting. But this is what Christians believe. And is, of course, very contrary to the theory of evolution, which suggests that the Earth is much, much older than 6,000 years old. And I have to put my hands up there and say, yeah, it's older. The Earth is older than 6,000 years old. You know, there has been much scientific research, and there is much scientific evidence to suggest, fossils, etc., to suggest that the Earth is older than 6,000 years old. And so this discovery Darwin made, having shocked the public who wanted to feel as though they had been designed for a purpose, this whole discovery made clear that design isn't real, and that it is just an illusion. And that's important to remember, that we can't, just because we assume design doesn't necessarily mean we have been designed. But let's move on to Lewis's quote now, and here he talks about the rival conceptions of God, and how obviously religion has different conceptions. And on page 35 he says that if you are a Christian, you do not have to believe that the main point in all the religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the whole is simply one huge mistake. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But of course, being a Christian does not mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. Does mean thinking that Christianity is right and they are wrong. As in arithmetic, there is only one right answer to a sum, and all other answers are wrong. But some answers are much nearer to being right than others. End quote there. And yeah, so he's saying that being a Christian allows them to actually be more liberal and accepting of the other conceptions of God, of the other religions, than an atheist who actually has to put their hands down and say, look, we've been wrong about this for 2,000 or so, for thousands of years, ever since the birth of religion in humanity. We've been wrong, and I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting we were wrong. You know, humanity's made many blunders, intellectual blunders throughout history. You only have to look as far as far as us believing that the Earth one time that the Earth was completely flat. You know, 1,000 years ago, it was common knowledge that the Earth was flat. Like, you wouldn't question it. In fact, some people who did question it, and some people who did create the theory that the Earth was spherical, were burned at the stake by the Roman Catholic Church. So we begin to see how religion has a sort of negative impact on society, on the progression of society in this kind of way. And as Dawkins said on page 151, he comments on the God of the gaps idea. He says that creationists eagerly seek a gap in present-day knowledge or understanding. If an apparent gap is found, it is assumed that God, by default, must fill it. What worries thoughtful theologians such as Bonhoeffer is that gaps shrink as science advances, and God is threatened with eventually having nothing to do and nowhere to hide. What worries scientists is something else. It is an essential part of the scientific enterprise to admit ignorance, even to exult in ignorance as a challenge to future conquests. As my friend Matt Ridley has written, most scientists are bored by what they have already discovered. It is ignorance that drives them on. Mystics exult in mystery and want it to stay mysterious. Scientists exult in mystery for a different reason. It gives them something to do. More generally, one of the truly bad effects of religion is that it is a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding. End quote. And that's something I would kind of partially agree with, but also partially disagree with. You know, I think, obviously I agree with the God of the gaps idea. I think that you shouldn't, if there's a gap in your knowledge, to assume that, say, God did it, or is merely placing your own theoretical framework on to your lack of understanding. I don't agree with that. But he says that on this thing, he says that one of the bad effects of religion is that it is a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding. And I have to say, I don't. It's okay to not know. You know, we all have to start somewhere. We all have to start not knowing. And so in a way, not knowing is a virtue, in a way. Because in order to know something, you have to not know first. And again, this is very kind of rigorous rationalist idea that Dawkins has that I don't particularly agree with there. But moving on to Lewis, on page 58, he says, now this is where he's kind of introducing the idea of Jesus and why Christianity is right compared to the other religions. He says, supposing God became man, suppose our human nature, which can suffer and die, was amalgamated with God's nature in one person, then that person could help us. He could surrender his will and suffer and die because he was man, and he could do it perfectly because he was God. You and I can go through this process only if God does it in us, but God can only do it if he becomes man. Our attempts at this dying will succeed only if we men share in God's dying, just as our thinking can succeed only because it is a drop out of the ocean of his intelligence. But we cannot share God's dying unless God dies, and he cannot die except by being man. That is the sense in which he pays our debt and suffers for us what he himself need not suffer at all. End quote. And that's interesting because what he describes there is basically the core, the esoteric kind of core of the Christian religion, which is this death and rebirth idea. It's this idea that we were once dead, but now we can be alive again through Jesus, which is what's kind of posited here. And I'd like to kind of add on to that, I think, by saying that though that's a very fascinating idea and a very lovely idea, this idea of rebirth, it's not an original idea. You'll find that this whole death and rebirth theme is common in religions from many different cultures and many different religions. Have this idea that of salvation, that you'll be reborn again and rise from the dead. The resurrection is the core of the Christian religion, but it's also the core of many other religions, is what I would argue as well. You only have to look as far as mythology, Egyptian mythology or Greek mythology, such as Hercules, to kind of get this idea that other religions have very similar themes to them. And Dawkins here, he quotes, he talks about the roots of morality. Why are we good? And and in this kind of chapter, he explains that we're good because from a Darwinian perspective, in order to survive, we need to be good to each other. In order to survive as a pack, as a human pack, we need to respect each other. We need to not, murder each other or steal from each other. It's just disadvantageous to our progression as a species if we constantly did these quote unquote sinful behaviours. But and he has a kind of rebuttal against the moral argument presented by Lewis that we can only be good with God, because he says on page 259, if there's no God, why be good? Posed like that, the question sounds positively ignoble. When a religious person puts it to me in this way, and many of them do, my immediate temptation is to issue the following challenge. Do you really mean to tell me the only reason you try to be good is to gain God's approval and reward, or to avoid his disapproval and punishment? That's not morality. That's just sucking up, apple polishing, looking over your shoulder at the great surveillance camera in the sky, or the still small wiretap inside your head, monitoring your every move, even your every base thought. As Einstein said, if people are good only because they fear punishment and hope for reward, then we are a sorry lot indeed. Michael Shearer, in The Science of Good and Evil, calls it a debate stopper. If you agree that in the absence of God you would commit robbery, rape and murder, you reveal yourself as an immoral person, and we would be well advised to steer a wide course around you. If, on the other hand, you admit that you would continue to be a good person even when not under divine surveillance, you have fatally undermined your claim that God is necessary for us to be good. I suspect that quite a lot of religious people do think religion is what motivates them to be good, especially if they belong to one of the faiths that systematically exploits personal guilt. End quote. And that has to be probably one of my favourite quotes from the book. Because it really expands upon this idea of guilt and shame, and how God is like, if you don't live up to these kind of perfect, ridiculously perfect expectations, you should feel ashamed in a way. You should feel guilty, which I really don't agree with. I think you are good enough as you are. There's no need to climb to these heights of perfectionism, if you like. And also, I like this thing as well because it reminds me of it reminds me of Orwell's 1984 by George Orwell, which was about a dystopian society controlled by this one dictator called Big Brother, and everyone had to love Big Brother, it kind of gives this idea that you're not intrinsically or positively motivated, but extrinsically and negatively motivated by God, because of this element of fear and threat which is fed into religion, which is fed into things like Christianity. This idea that if you, yes, you'll be rewarded if you do good, but if you do bad, you're going to go to hell. That sort of thing. And that idea it jars with me, that one. But let's look at Lewis's kind of rebuttal. On page 177, he says, "You remember what I said in chapter 2 about begetting and making?" I'll just come out the quote there. Yes, begetting and making. Making is where you make something, but begetting is like where you almost clone yourself, put yourself into something else. So like when you have a baby or something, you don't like make a baby, but you beget a baby, if you like. But anyway, back to the quote. So, we are not begotten by God. We are only made by him. In our natural state, we are not sons of God. Only, so to speak, statues. We have not got Zoe or spiritual life, only bios or biological life, which is presently going to run down and die. Now, the whole offer which Christianity makes is this, that we can, if we let God have his way, come to share in the life of Christ. If we do, we shall then be sharing a life which was begotten, not made, which always has existed and always will exist. Christ is the Son of God. If we share in this kind of life, we shall also be sons of God as well. We shall love the Father as he does, and the Holy Ghost will arise in us. He came to this world and became a man in order to spread to other men the kind of life he has, by what I call good infection. Every Christian is to become a little Christ. The whole purpose of becoming a Christian is simply nothing else. End quote. And that's very interesting, that quote. It's this idea of little Christ. I don't know whether to find that quite sort of comforting or quite creepy, actually. Like we all sort of become little Christs in a way, like I'm a little Christ. I'm not really sure about that quote. It kind of, yeah. But I think, rather than laying into him here, I'm actually going to sort of say that I agree with him that it provides us very strong spiritual comfort for people, and this is why a lot of people are religious and they have these beliefs. I think is because if we admit that we are just products of biology and nature, we know the universe is going to come to an end. We know we're going to die at some point. Even scientists would admit that the universe is going to come to an end at some point. Everything is breaking apart and dying. The Earth will get destroyed by the sun at some point, or, we're not going to last forever. And because of this, Lewis is saying we need to nurture our spiritual life, as opposed to just our natural biological life, which I agree with. We do need to nurture our spiritual life. But obviously I think Lewis is mistaken about what this spiritual life actually is. It actually has nothing, in my opinion, the spiritual life has nothing to do with subscribing to a doctrine or subscribing to a belief system that someone else has given you. It's merely a state of being. And I suppose that's where he gets it wrong there. But as just going to move to kind of Dawkins's rebuttal. He says, what's wrong with religion? Why be so hostile? And he gives an answer to this on page 319, where he talks about fundamentalism and the subversion of science. He says that, quote, fundamentalists know they are right because they have read the truth in a holy book, and they know in advance that nothing will budge them from their belief. The truth of the holy book is an axiom, not the end product of a process of reasoning. The book is true, and if the evidence seems to contradict it, it is the evidence that must be thrown out, not the book. By contrast, what I, as a scientist, believe, for example, evolution, I believe not because of reading a holy book, but because I have studied the evidence. It really is a very different matter. Books about evolution are not believed because they are holy. They are believed because they present overwhelming quantities of mutually buttressed evidence. When a science book is wrong, somebody eventually discovers the mistake and it is corrected in subsequent books. That conspicuously doesn't happen with holy books. End quote. And yes, I kind of agree with him there that fundamentalism goes against science, because science is about having a hypothesis, proving that hypothesis wrong, and then discovering that there is a deeper truth to something. And it's this sort of empirical attitude of science, which I quite like, actually. An experimental attitude, let's say. Whereas there's nothing experimental at all about just reading a holy book, like the Quran or the Bible, and believing it face value that it's true, just because someone's told you that it's the word of God or it's the ultimate word. You know, you've got to... That just shows you have no critical ability. That shows you have absolutely no ability to critically analyse something and to look at something and go, is this true? You know, it just shows that you have this, you have this lack of ability to question things. And I think that's what Dawkins is saying here, that, you know, holy books don't admit that they were wrong, you know, or the writers of holy books wouldn't admit that they're wrong, but then they, you know, change their mind. You know, whereas science does. Science admits that it's wrong and then changes. But let's move to Lewis's kind of rebuttal now. On page 140, he says that faith, in the sense in which I'm here using the word, is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted, in spite of your changing moods. For moods will change, whatever view your reason takes. I know that by experience. Now that I am a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbable. But when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable. Consequently, one must train the habit of faith. End quote. And this is almost quite telling, this quote, of the term dogmatism. Just so you're familiar with the term dogmatism, dogmatism means basically clinging to a worldview, even if you kind of know deep down that it's wrong. It means clinging to your beliefs and not letting your beliefs go despite contradicting evidence. And, you know, this idea that you have to train the habit of faith, you have to train it. So, you know, you can't just, you know, discover God, for instance. Say, you know, I don't know, you saw Jesus once and then you discovered God. You know, you couldn't, Lewis is admitting here that you can't just discover God. You've got to actually reinforce that belief in your mind constantly. I presume by praying or constantly going to church or something like that, but it is quite telling of how kind of slippery this idea of faith is. And so moving on to Dawkins, on page 325, he talks about the dark side of absolutism. And he says that in the United States of recent years, the phrase American Taliban was begging to be coined, and a swift Google search nets more than a dozen websites that have done so. The quotations that they anthologize from American religious leaders and faith-based politicians chillingly recall the narrow bigotry, heartless cruelty, and sheer nastiness of the Afghan Taliban, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Wahhabi authorities of Saudi Arabia. The webpage called The American Taliban is a particularly rich source of obnoxiously balmy quotations, beginning with a prize one from somebody called Ann Coulter, who says, "We should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity." End quote of that one. Other gems include Congressman Bob Dornan's "Don't use the word gay unless it is an acronym for Got AIDS Yet," and General William G. Boykin's "George Bush was not elected by a majority of the voters in the United States. He was appointed by God." All the ingredients are there. Slavish adherence to a misunderstood old text, hatred of women, modernity, rival religions, science and pleasure, love of punishment, bullying, narrow-minded, bossy interference in every aspect of life. The Afghan Taliban and the American Taliban are good examples of what happens when people take their scriptures literally and seriously. They provide a horrifying modern enactment of what life might have been like under the theocracy of the Old Testament. End quote. And that's very, very telling of what could happen, as he says, if we lived under the Bible, or if we lived solely under one religious text. It would be the big brother. It would be the ultimate big brother, the ultimate unquestioning of our morals, of what we deem to be right and wrong. Where it says we should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity, I just don't see how this is the attitude of someone who is morally good. What troubles me about religion, particularly, is that if you believe, you seem to believe that religion will make you a good person, but clearly these people are bigoted, these people are opinionated, these people are talking about killing people and throwing insults about gay people and saying that George Bush wasn't elected by the people but by God. I mean, the fact that these kind of people are in positions of power is quite terrifying. America is basically the most powerful country in the world, and yet you have these kind of political leaders who are bigoted in the most accurate sense of the word. So there's much to reflect on with that quote, I think. Let's just have a quick break now. Okay, welcome back. Let's move on to Lewis's quote. He says on page 89, actually, hang on, sorry, I need to be earlier. He says, he talks about sexual morality, C.S. Lewis, And he says that poster after poster, film after film, novel after novel, associate the idea of sexual indulgence with ideas of health, normality, youth, frankness, and good humour. Now, this association is a lie. Like all powerful lies, it is based on truth. The truth acknowledged above, that sex in itself, apart from the excesses and obsessions that have grown round it, is normal and healthy, and all the rest of it. The lie consists in the suggestion that any sexual act to which you are tempted at the moment is also healthy and normal. The monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside marriage is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual, from all the other kinds of union which were intended to go along with it and make up the total union. End quote. And this obviously explains Lewis's view on sexual morality. I'm not sure I do sort of agree with that. I think it's okay to have sex outside of marriage. That's absolutely fine. He says this idea that sex inside marriage is part of the kind of total union of love and so on. I can see where he's coming from. That sex is something. Yes, it is something that can be abused very easily. Something that can be abused. I agree with him. And we can forget about the sort of love component of it, which that's what sex is for. It's for magnifying love, as I understand it. But I don't agree with him about this idea of sex outside of marriage. I think that's just a very rigid Christian idea. That's just very kind of set in its ways and almost harks back to the bigotry of Dawkins' quote before, that fundamentalism thinks that it's right and it can't kind of drop its guard and it can't admit that it's wrong about things. And yes, he's wrong about that. Let's move on to Dawkins's quote now. It says on page 326 of the God Delusion, he talks about faith and homosexuality as part of the reasons to criticize religion. And he says, quote, "In Afghanistan, under the Taliban, the official punishment for homosexuality was execution by the tasteful method of burial alive under a wall pushed over on top of the victim. The crime itself being a private act performed by consenting adults who were doing nobody else any harm. We again have here the classic hallmark of religious absolutism. My own country has no right to be smug. Private homosexuality was a criminal offence in Britain up until, astonishingly, 1967. In 1954, the British mathematician Alan Turing, a candidate along with John von Neumann for the title of Father of the Computer, committed suicide after being convicted of the criminal offence of homosexual behaviour in private. Admittedly, Turing was not buried alive under a wall pushed over by a tank. He was offered a choice between 2 years in prison. You can imagine how the other prisoners would have treated him, and a course of hormone injections which could be said to amount to chemical castration and would have caused him to grow breasts. His final private choice was an apple that he injected with cyanide." End quote. And this is just incredibly telling of the bigotry and the way religions treat homosexuality, and not just sexuality in general, as examined before with sex outside of marriage and stuff. The way they treat homosexuality is even worse. They have no understanding that homosexuals are human beings. There is no there is no difference. To me, from personal experience, I find it has nothing to do with your sexual orientation. Has nothing to do with how good you are as a person. And it's just an example of the kind of closed-mindedness that religion imposes on people. The way they throw a wall on top of someone and murder them like that, and this whole situation with Alan Turing, it gives the impression that it's not a healthy thing to be involved in a kind of religious ideology. And this is actually further confirmed by a quote by Lewis. I'll move back to Mere Christianity, where Lewis says on page 89, when a man makes a moral choice, two things are involved. One is the act of choosing. The other is the various feelings, impulses, and so on, which his psychological outfit presents him with, and which are the raw materials of his choice. The desire of a man for a woman would be of the first kind. The perverted desire of a man for a man would be of the second. End quote. And yeah, obviously Lewis holds this kind of assumption. And yes, he was talking in sort of wartime Britain, where as part of the culture, back then people would have had that kind of attitude towards homosexuals. But still, if Lewis is, as he claims to be, a progressive thinker, if Christianity is a progressive religion, then why would he have this kind of sick attitude towards people of a certain sexuality? It just shows a complete ignorance on his part. And interestingly, on page 208, he talks about how sort of religion the way people view religion can be scarred by what Christians actually do. For example, on page 208 he says, Christ told us to judge by results. A tree is known by its fruit. When we Christians behave badly or fail to behave well, we are making Christianity unbelievable to the outside world. The wartime posters told us that careless talk costs lives. It is equally true that careless lives cost talk. Our careless lives set the outer world talking, and we give them grounds for talking in a way that throws doubt on the truth of Christianity itself. End quote. Oh. And yeah, well, yes, it does. It does throw doubt on the truth of Christianity itself if Christians behave badly, but it's often quite expected. I would expect people to behave badly if they followed a set of beliefs that condemned people of a certain sexuality. That's how I would expect them to kind of behave. So that's the kind of irony I find in that quote, really. And moving on to Dawkins's quote, it says on page 333, he talks about faith and the sanctity of human life and the attitude against, this is in reference to the attitude against abortion. They think that, they sort of talk about in terms of sacred sperm, if you like, or, you can't kill a living organism because it's wrong. And Dawkins says, quote, a certain kind of religious mind cannot see the moral difference between killing a microscopic cluster of cells on the one hand and killing a fully grown doctor on the other. Mark Juergensmeyer, in his chilling book Terror in the Mind of God, prints a photograph of the Reverend Paul Hill holding a banner reading, "Is it wrong to stop the murder of innocent babies?" Both look nice, rather preppy young men, smiling engagingly, casually well dressed, the very opposite of staying-eyed loonies. Yet they and their friends of the Army of God, AOG, made it their business to set fire to abortion clinics, and they have made no secret of their desire to kill doctors. On 29th of July 1994, Paul Hill took a shotgun and murdered Dr. John Britton and his bodyguard James Barrett outside Britton's clinic in Pensacola, Florida. He then gave himself up to the police, saying he had killed the doctor to prevent the future deaths of innocent babies. End quote. And that's an example of what can happen if people hold a certain set of beliefs and they think that it's wrong, abortion is wrong, and so we're going to kill. Which is actually, and the thing that really gets me about the quote is this is actually quite ironic, because they're fighting for the sanctity of human life and the sanctity of babies' lives, or the lives of, an embryo or something, and yet they're easily taking human life away. They're taking the life of this doctor away and his bodyguard. There's so much hypocrisy involved there that really is enough to make your blood boil. On page 345, Dawkins sort of explains all this religious hypocrisy with a quote from Voltaire. He said, Voltaire got it right long ago. He said that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. End quote. And yes, if you firmly believe something is right, like you should kill this doctor because he supports abortion, then yeah, you're gonna go and do it, aren't you? Because in your heart of hearts, or in the deepest part of your subconscious, you have this belief that it's right to do that, when of course that is completely deluded and a sign of lunacy in a way. Moving on to sort of Lewis's quote, he says on page 220, expect not merely a change, but a new method of producing the change. Evolution itself, as a method of producing change, will be superseded. When the thing happened, very few people noticed that it was happening. The Christian view is precisely that the next step has already appeared, and it is really new. It is not a change from brainy men to brainier men. It is a change that goes off in a totally different direction. A change from being creatures of God to being sons of God. It is not something arising out of the natural process of events, but something coming into nature from outside. End quote. And that's actually, I find that a really interesting quote there, because I partially sort of disagree with it, and partially agree with it, actually. He says that evolution will be superseded. So I think what he means there is like biological evolution would be superseded. The human brain or the human rationality has grown to a point where it doesn't need to grow anymore. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think, yes, our rationality can grow more, but he's right in saying that our rationality will have a limit. There'll be a limit to how rational we need to be, or how scientific we need to be as human beings. And I agree with him that the change will go off in a different direction. I think it will go off, personally, I think humanity will go off in a more spiritual direction. I think we'll learn to expand our consciousness more, and learn to accept the present moment more, rather than know a load about science. Knowing science isn't the be-all and end-all, as sort of Dawkins tries to assert there. But I disagree with him in the sense that we'll go from being creatures of God to sons of God, because I don't think God has anything to do with it. he says it is not something arising out of the natural processes of events, but something coming into nature from outside. And no, it's not coming into nature from outside. I think it will come from within us. We are responsible for our spiritual progression as human beings, and we can't just rely on external sources. So, moving on to Richard Dawkins's quote, he talks here about sort of childhood abuse and the escape from religion. And here on page 349, he gives an anecdote about a sort of real life story in Italy, and it says that, quote, in 1858, Edgardo Mortara, a 6-year-old child of Jewish parents living in Bologna, was legally seized by the papal police, acting under orders from the Inquisition. Edgardo was forcibly dragged away from his weeping mother and distraught father to the catechumens, house for the conversion of Jews and Muslims, in Rome, and thereafter brought up as a Roman Catholic. Aside from occasional brief visits under the close priestly supervision, his parents never saw him again. And on page 351, he describes sort of what this story implies. He says, "This story of the Italian Inquisition and its attitude to children is particularly revealing of the religious mind, and the evils that arise specifically because it is religious. First is the remarkable perception by the religious mind that a sprinkle of water and a brief verbal incantation can totally change a child's life, taking precedence over parental consent, the child's own consent, the child's own happiness and psychologically well-being, over everything that ordinary common sense and human feeling would see as important. Second is the extraordinary fact that the priests, cardinals and pope seem genuinely not to have understood what a terrible thing they were doing to poor Edgardo Mortara. It passes all sensible understanding, but they sincerely believe they were doing him a good turn by taking him away from his parents and giving him a Christian upbringing. They felt it a duty of protection. Third is the presumptuousness whereby religious people know without evidence that the faith of their birth is the one true faith, all others being aberrations or downright false. And yes, this quote reminds me of a time when I as I was sort of researching religion once, I typed into Google search, and you can do this for yourself. Type into Google search, how many religions are there in the world? And it will come up with this shocking statistic that there are actually 4,200 religions in the world today. And this is shocking precisely because of how seriously people take their independent religious beliefs. Because how can you know if you're born into religion, or Richard Dawkins is talking about childhood and being raised in a religion. You're raised in one out of the 4,200 other religions, and immediately your religion is the right one. The chances of that is quite literally 1 in 4,200. I think there's this quite ironic saying that actually Christians are a lot like atheists. They're not too far from atheists. It's just that they're one God more, or atheists are one God less. Because in a lot of other religions, they're called polytheistic religions, which mean they believe in multiple different gods. Whereas obviously Christianity is a monotheistic religion. It believes in one God. And so it just goes to show that there's never going to be a human consensus on this at all. There's no element of consensus there. But anyway, we'll go to Lewis's kind of final rebuttal here, and this comes at the end of Mere Christianity, and he says that, quote, "There must be a real giving up of the self. As long as your own personality is what you are bothering about, you are not going to him at all. The very first step is to forget about the self altogether. It will come when you are looking for him. Even in social life, you will never make a good impression on other people until you stop thinking about what sort of impression you are making. If you simply try to tell the truth, without caring twopence how often it has been told before, you will, 9 times out of 10, become original without even having noticed it. Give up yourself, and you will find your real self. Lose your life, and you will save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favourite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fibre of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will, in the long run, only be hatred, fall into hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him, everything else thrown in. End quote. And yes, I quite like that sort of summary. It's got a beautiful summary. Lewis is a very crafty writer. He's a very, very good writer. And so he's able to sort of create this very sort of poetic style of writing, which I quite like. Submit with every fibre of your being and you'll find eternal life. It's quite stirring, isn't it? I do actually agree with a part of his quote, which is where he says that in order to find kind of spirituality, there must be a real giving up of the self. And if you've ever heard about enlightenment or spiritual work or consciousness work through meditation and such, you'll know that you have to kind of get rid of this idea of yourself or your ego in order to become content and happy with life. And become one with everything else. You've got to get rid of this illusion of separateness. And that's interesting there, how it is quite a sort of enlightened thing to say, and I agree with him on that point, on the sort of no self spiritual point. But obviously, judging by everything we've heard from Dawkins so far, I really can't accept Christ, or I can't accept religion at all. I can't accept the doctrine at all. I can't accept something just because someone else has told me. I have to discover it for myself. As he says here, I have to give up myself in order to find truth. My beliefs get in the way of everything, of course. My dogma gets in the way of everything. And it's only when I'm open-minded to things that I can be truly kind of happy. And so, yes, I think that's a very interesting end to mere Christianity there. Let's move to the end of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. He talks about a much-needed gap, ? On page 418, he says, "Science flings open the narrow window through which we are accustomed to viewing the spectrum of possibilities. We are liberated by calculation and reason to visit regions of possibility that had once seemed out of bounds or inhibited by dragons." And he concludes his book by saying, "I am thrilled to be alive at a time when humanity is pushing against the limits of human understanding. Even better, we may eventually discover that there are no limits." End quote. And yes, I very much agree with him there, that actually there are no limits to human understanding. That there's nothing, there is no God there as a limiter to our understanding. Our understanding goes on and on and on. It's an infinite expansion, if you like. Our knowledge expands as our consciousness expands and awareness expands as well. And so this ties into a quote I heard when doing my dissertation last year at uni. I was talking about this with my tutor, and he said, "The more you know, the less you know." Yeah, and that's very telling, really, because you have, the more you find out about something, the more you realise that there's more to find out. You get kind of drawn in. Knowledge almost kind of it's sort of like being pulled from the inside of a bush into a big valley or something. That's what knowledge is like. The more you learn something, the more you want to learn more. It's like a snowball effect of knowledge, if you like, which I quite like. And I'll just end here, with my opinion. So, summarising the two books, Mere Christianity and the God Delusion, and kind of thinking about which one I think is more right. And I'll have to conclude by saying that I am an agnostic. I do not think, by that I mean, I think that it's not actually possible to know if there is a God or not. Because the question of God implies God as a concept. It implies God as an assumption. And because it's just an assumption, there's no evidential proof, and so you can't prove it. But you can't disprove it either. And so it's one of those paradoxes that you can't prove or disprove. We have to remain open-minded. We have to remain agnostic. I'll say that Christianity, amongst other popular religions, though, are religions of shame and guilt. It says that we're not good enough as we are, and that in order to be good enough, we have to love God instead of ourselves. And I emphasize this, instead of ourselves. This idea totally contradicts the book I reviewed in episode 1 of Lawson Literature. If you want to go back to that, it's where I review a book called I Love Me, which explores the fact that you can only be truly happy if you love yourself and you believe that you are good enough as you are, because you are good enough. It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. It doesn't matter. What matters is now, is who you are now. You are already perfect as you are, and I don't necessarily like this idea that you're born into the world. A perfect baby, if you like. Babies are completely innocent. They haven't done anything wrong, and yet they're fed this doctrine that they've sinned just for being alive, and that the only way to kind of get out of this sin is to believe that this guy 2,000 years ago died for you. I mean, how strange is that? How twisted is that? If you think about it in that kind of way. And I also want to kind of say that though, and as for science and rational understanding, which Dawkins propagates here, I say that though rational understanding is not the be-all and end-all of human development, it is still one stage more advanced than irrational and supernatural understanding. I think that, therefore, the God Delusion wins Mere Christianity versus the God Delusion. Just. But that said, I also want to kind of end it here by saying that both the books are wrong. I'll start with Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity presents an interesting case with objective morality outside of ourselves. But you see, this argument can be countered by evolution. For example, a pack of lions don't kill each other because it's not beneficial to their survival as a group. So to say that God is the reason for our existence is ultimately an assumption. There you go. So that's basically why mere Christianity is wrong there. And the reason the God delusion is also wrong is because, well, the God Delusion is an important book for humanity as it progresses into the rational stage of its psychological evolution. But Dawkins, as a rationalist, forgets one thing: post-rationalism. Science, though useful, isn't the ultimate answer to human development, as humans need to develop consciously as well as rationally. By consciously, I mean learning to love and embrace what we don't know and remaining open-minded. True spirituality goes beyond belief, as anyone with a regular meditation habit will find out. Thoughts and concepts aren't everything, and this dovetails nicely into a quote, one of my favourite quotes of all time, by John Lennon, who wrote a song called God. And he says that God is a concept by which we measure our pain. And I think that summarises God for me, which leads me to the object of the day, which is an antiseptic wipe. Yeah, you guessed it. God is an antiseptic wipe. You know, he is the guy who we turn to for comfort in times of darkness and pain and suffering and despair. We'll turn to God. But as we've discovered with the God delusion, you can't just turn to God when God doesn't exist. And so what's the solution? Well, you love yourself. Love is always the solution, not God. Sorry, God. I want to wrap this whole episode up by saying that I find theological debates fascinating, but often hindered by dogma and people being unwilling to admit that their beliefs about reality might be wrong. People's worldviews are complex, delicate parts of their identity, and so should be treated with respect. That, I believe, is the only way we can shepherd the human mind past false notions and beliefs.